Good evening and welcome. I'm David, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore, and we are pleased to be partnering with Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition to welcome Dan Egan to our At Home with Literati series in support of The Devil's Element, Phosphorus, and a World Out of Balance. He'll be in conversation with Laura Rubin of Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. A quick webinar overview for all attending. The chat is closed, but you can keep your chat window open as I'll be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is accessible, so please submit questions, and live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. If you're watching us later on YouTube, links to purchase the books are in the description. A reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. And now, Laura, take it away.
Thanks so much. Thank you first to Literati Bookstore for hosting us. For those of you who aren't in the region, they are an independent bookseller in Ann Arbor and serve a lot of Southeast Michigan, and where it's really a treasure to have them as they host a lot of these book talks and have great books and book service. So thank you, Literati. I have the pleasure tonight of introducing a journalist and author that I've always admired in my career. So I am the director of the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. We are a coalition of 175 NGOs throughout the Great Lakes region, and we're the collective voice for the NGO community at the federal level on Great Lakes restoration and protection. So a lot of member groups across the country, and one of our top issues is nutrient reduction. And so that's very applicable to the topic at hand tonight. So I am very excited to introduce Dan Egan, who is the author of a New York Times bestseller. Many of us in the Great Lakes region have read this, called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. If you haven't, it's a great book, run out and get it. He's a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with his wife and children. And tonight we're discussing The Devil's Element. I have the book here to show the nice neon green that most of us know in our waterways, all too familiar with it. And so Dan, I just want to introduce you and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and say hello.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. And yeah, so that book, well, I guess my face is on the screen now, but if you could show it again. There's not a description inside the cover, but it looks like fire, like green fire, but that's Lake Erie, and that's toxic algae. There's a boat there, and it's researching, I think, collecting data on that toxic gook.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've been a journalist for 30 years. I worked at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel from 2002 to 2021, and then I kind of broke away. I'm affiliated with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's School of Freshwater Sciences now, and I do long-form journalism, and this is my second book, and I am happy to be here to talk about it.
Well, great. Thank you. I really enjoyed reading your book and learned a lot about phosphorus. It made me realize what a narrow angle I have had on phosphorus. I've worked about 25 years in the Great Lakes on water issues. And I had no idea about the critical role that phosphorus has played in some of the most lethal substances on Earth. You give us a great history of phosphorus, fire bombs, rat poisoning, nerve gas. What I did know is the vital role that phosphorus has played as fertilizer, and that has sustained billions of people over history, but also the disastrous impacts that it's having on our freshwater ecosystems, in particular in the Great Lakes and rivers and lakes that feed them. So while you give us this, thorough exploration and history of the topic that I don't think most of the public would know, my first question is sort of what inspired you to write this book? What is it about phosphorus that pulled you in and made you want to write this book?
Yeah, it's not the sexiest of topics on the surface. But when I was doing research for the Great Lakes book that came out in 2017, I did a chapter on Lake Erie and the mess that they're in with algae blooms. I know they're called algal blooms, but I call them algae blooms because I'm writing for regular people, and that's what they call it. And the more I looked into the history of fertilizer, of chemical fertilizer, and then more specifically the history of phosphorus and the role it's played in history since it was first discovered in the 1600s, the more I thought, this is way more interesting than the Great Lakes. And so that book came out in 2017, and we gave it a good push as far as promoting it and stuff for a number of months. And the publisher asked if I had any other ideas, and I said phosphorus, and they just kind of looked at me with like, why? And so I wrote a proposal for the Great Lakes book that took about 2 years to be refined and then finally be sold. And I sold the same publisher, same editor on this book within 2 weeks, because there's just so many interesting facets to our history with phosphorus that he said, all right, go for it. But it's a weird book, it's just kind of, it jumps around. I think there's an arc, there's a coherence to it. But that took a lot of work. So yeah, that's, when I told people when I was still working on the book, it only came out last Tuesday, a week ago Tuesday. When I told them I was working on a book about phosphorus, they would look at me like I was diagnosed with something bad, kind of a blank stare. But then you start telling stories about it, and that's what I try to do in the book. People get interested. So that's how it came to be.
Yeah, thanks. And in reading it, it looks like the research took you days, weeks, years to write, and also around the world in terms of the places that you went. Tell us a little bit about how that transpired. I know in there were different places you visited. Was it all part of the book, or were some of those visits earlier done in your journalism days?
Well, that's a good question. No, I think it was all pretty much, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but yeah, some of the Lake Erie and Green Bay, Bay of Green Bay on Lake Michigan, some of that reporting I had done for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel during my tenure there from 2002 to 2021. But most of it was done from scratch. And when I was writing this Great Lakes book, I remember that was a lot of material that I had just accrued over more than a decade of working at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, that the newspaper gave me carte blanche to just repackage it as a book. And I thought, oh, this will be a breeze. And in some ways it was, as far as not having to go out and travel and report. But in other ways, it was really shackling. It was like rehabbing a house instead of building one from scratch. Because I'd want to change some big long section, and then because it didn't flow with another section of the book, and then I'd realize, well, that section has to be the way it is because it's like a load-bearing wall. If we're going to stick with the rehabbing the house analogy, it's like it needs to be explained this way. And so I felt hamstrung. And so when I got the green light to write about this green algae stuff, I thought, I'm free, and this is going to be great. But it was hard. It was still really hard.
Yeah.
And so I did a lot of traveling. COVID really messed things up. I started working on the book probably in the fall of 2018. I had some side projects going, but I really got going in 2019. And I was fortunately able to take a number of trips that the book couldn't have been written without me having taken them. To Belgium and to England and to Germany and to Western Ontario and Florida. I went to Florida 3 times. I went to Gulf of Mexico once. Anyway, I was going to go more places, but with the COVID lockdown, couldn't go many places. So I was forced to do what newspaper journalists even 15 years ago had to do, and that's a lot of work on the phone. but I'm pretty practiced in that. And so it's kind of interesting because this is happening during COVID. I wrote so much of this book in a minivan in a park near my house.
That's right. You close with that.
Yeah, I think, I mentioned that in the acknowledgements. Yeah, I was every day just like, well, the thing about a minivan, any kind of modern car, really, those seats, when you're not going 65 miles an hour down the highway, they're very comfortable. You can recline them and move them into different positions. And then you have a great stereo system right at your fingertips. And then you can drive your office to like Jimmy John's, some food. So it wasn't as bad as it sounds, but it wasn't what I had envisioned when I first started. So yeah, I did a lot of travel for it, and most everything from my history as a journalist was new to me. So like I learned right along as I was writing it, and some of the stuff just blew my mind, and I think that, I just tried to convey that as I was writing, because there's some, when you say it's a book about phosphorus, it's really not a book about phosphorus. It's just about the circle of life that Earth has long sustained, and how we've kind of cracked it and turned it into a straight line. And then when I say that, I mean specifically like our use of fertilizer. We used to just reuse fertilizer, that's manure, right? Or whatever would make a crop grow. And then once we figured out that we could go to certain deposits of phosphorus, which is one of 3 critical nutrients in modern agriculture, the other 2 being nitrogen and potassium. Once we cracked that code, we really unleashed a gusher of life onto this planet, for good and ill. When we did it early on, we had less than 1 billion people. Now we have 8 billion, and we're barreling toward 9 billion, and we'd never be here without phosphorus and chemical fertilizer. But we can't keep barreling forward at the pace that we are. So I was learning this on the fly, and it got way more interesting than I thought it was going to be, even when I was pitching it to the publisher. And it was hard to kind of contain myself, because I could have written this thing for 10 years. So
yeah. Well, I have to say, as somebody who didn't know the whole history of it, those stories that you tell, about the guano hunting and going all over the world searching for phosphorus early on, and some of the early scientists add quite a richness to the book. With all of those learnings and travelings, what was the most surprising thing for you that you learned in the process?
Just how unnatural, and I haven't thought this through. That's a good question. But I guess what I learned was just how unnatural the modern food system is. And it has to be, because we have to be super efficient to feed 8 billion people 3 times, or feed them to the extent that they don't starve. And it's a necessary system, but it isn't sustainable. It just really isn't, because there's only so many phosphorus rock reserves out there. And in the United States, we're on pace to run out of our primary deposits in 3 to 4 decades. At that point, we become dependent on other countries for our nutritional security, for the food on our table. And, there's long been talk about energy security and independence, but there's workarounds for oil, and there are no workarounds for phosphorus. we need it's in every living cell on Earth. Without phosphorus, there would be no life. But without chemical fertilizer, phosphorus, which is a big component, there would not be 8 billion people on this planet. And now we're heading toward 9, and we're kind of on a collision course, because at the same time we're running out of the proven reserves, at least in North America at the moment, we're also we have a history of overusing it to the point that we're poisoning our waters, because this stuff is it's like Miracle Grow. It is Miracle Grow. It makes crops grow like at freakish rates, but that property of phosphorus doesn't disappear or dissipate when it washes off a crop and goes into our water. It just grows stuff that we don't want, instead of soybeans and corn kernels, it's growing toxic algae that's poisonous.
Yeah, and you make the strong case that, phosphorus is the oil of our time. You talk about peak phosphorus. I know we hear, that was a new term to me. I hear peak oil. How realistic do you think the threat is of running out of phosphorus?
Well, we don't have to run out of it to have trouble with it. And so, there was some research that came out of Australia, like in 2011, when they were saying that the sunset on our reserves was going to come in like 70 or 80 years, at which point humanity was going to be in dire straits. And other people say it's like 300 or 400 years. And, so phosphorus doesn't disappear. It's like water drops, like a raindrop may land in a lake, or it may land in a glacier, or it may land in Gary, Indiana, and, and become toxic water. But we don't lose water. It just circles through the system over and over. And so does phosphorus. But we manage it like we use it once and then we just flush it into the water. And so if we keep doing this, it's going to happen, like on the order of, 300 years, maybe. Let's be generous with what the industry says, 350, 400 years, we've got, left in the tank for phosphorus globally. That's not that long of a time. That's really not a very long time. And we also don't have to run out of the reserves. Now, I guess I should be a little specific here. When I talk about reserves, that's the deposits of phosphorus rock. And there's only certain types of rocks that are rich with phosphorus. And they're typically sedimentary rocks, which are basically just accreted and condensed, compressed life, because phosphorus circles over and over and over again. But we don't have to run out of that stuff, or even if we do run out of it in 350 years, or don't run out of it, it's not spread across the globe equally. So like I said earlier, there's energy security and food security, and we can work around for energy security. We can't work around for food security. And that's just here in the wealthy United States. And you think about countries, all over the globe that are just barely getting by. A phosphorus shortage could come. There was a shortage in 2008 just because of production, and there were food riots in Haiti and in India. And so, we're on thinner ice than we think here. I would argue. And I don't want to be gloom and doom about it. And that's not the goal of this book. And the book isn't really like a prescription, like, a call to action. We must do this, this, and this. The goal of the book is just to get people to think about, like, wow, our whole system is set up on something that really isn't in the long term sustainable, but it can be if we just start thinking of phosphorus not as something to be used once and flushed away, or not as a complete waste, as too often we think of manure. Manure is a trove of nutrition for humanity, and it needs to be recognized and managed as such.
Yeah. Thanks. And in the book, this is getting into some of the more specific pieces in the book, but, you clearly make the case that in our polluted lakes, our problems are from unregulated agriculture. And I know that in the Great Lakes, this is a big issue we work on. You have a quote from the mayor of Toledo and stories from residents of Toledo around the Toledo drinking water crisis that are hard to hear. The quote from the mayor is, "We live in a state where our legislature is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Farm Bureau." And you quote also the late Dave Spangler, who said, "Everything they're doing is basically voluntary, and the lake is just as bad as it ever was. I don't know what the answer is other than more regulation. I see no other way." So one of the things, from my perspective is, do you agree with these sentiments? And what do you think are some of the ways we can get out of this, or some of the solutions?
Well, I don't have to agree with them to find them of utility as a journalist, because I think that they're legitimate perspectives.
Yeah.
And I don't want to, I don't think it's going to do anybody any good to or I don't think I'm going to do anybody any good to start demonizing and vilifying the agriculture industry, because I had breakfast this morning and I'll have it tomorrow and the next day and the next day. We need food, obviously. They're operating, they being agriculturists, farmers, under a system that a lot of it they probably don't like, although they did help create this system. A lot of them are just trying to make a living, but they do need to be better regulated, because as much as we need food, we need water, and we're moving at cross purposes here. Too often now, agriculture is threatening freshwater resources, and it doesn't have to be this way. One of the big problems we have right now is, the regulations that we have are not effective, and that's made manifest in the annual algae blooms on Lake Erie that they predict every June. I mean, they're as predictable as leaves falling in the fall now. And it shouldn't be this way. In some ways, it's kind of frightening that we've gotten so used to this, that it's become just kind of natural. But it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, we just have to be smarter about how we apply, chemical fertilizer, and also how we manage all this manure. And the manure is a huge component of this problem. And the reason it is because when we got the Clean Water Act in 1972, Congress decided to leave agriculture largely alone. The idea at the time was there was so much pollution coming out of pipes and smokestacks that we need to deal with that stat pronto. And this idea of waste coming off of a farm field was really not on the front burner for people, because at the time agricultural operations were smaller, and for forever until the modern era, farmers did everything they could do to keep in balance, in nutrient balance, with their crops and their field. The simple way to describe it is a cow would graze, the cow would poop, and then that poop would grow grass and the cow would eat it, and then the cow would poop, and on and on and on and on, the circle of life. And we cracked that, and it wasn't a big deal. We cracked that by just flushing this stuff away. It wasn't perceived as a big deal in the 1970s, but now it is a big deal, as big as some of these farms are getting. When you have 8,000, 10,000 head of cattle, and as much as they're making milk, they're making manure every single day. And I think too often that's viewed as something to be disposed of. And a lot of the farmers will tell you, we're using that to fertilize the fields, but those fields are getting that stuff whether they need it or not, because that manure needs to be removed from these massive lagoons of sewage on the CAFOs. And we need a change in perspective here. We need to recognize that manure as the nutritional trove that it is. And this book starts in a bunch of places, but one of the earlier points is like the lengths that the British were going to keep their fields productive. And they were throwing everything they could on it: blood, hair, fabric, bones became huge. They talk about how they looted the battlefields of Europe to grind up the bones and spread it as fertilizer. If those guys could see these lagoons of manure today, their jaw would drop. They'd be like, oh my God, the mother lode, and that's what it is. But we're taking that mother lode, and too often we're just flushing it into the lakes and the rivers and the streams and the ponds, and creating this goop, this toxic algae goop. So it's not a call to action, the book. It's really just kind of opening eyes, saying the path we're on isn't sustainable. It just isn't. And so we've got to look out for our water. We've got to look out for our nutrition security, and they're not mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, they're bound together as tightly as the circle of life. So,
yeah. And in the book, you take us to the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee and the Mississippi and the Great Lakes, Green Bay, all over the place, that have challenges. We've talked a little bit about regulation, but I know in the last chapter, I think it's called Waste Not, you provide some examples about ways of reusing some of the human waste in particular. Was this something that you think gives us hope in the future? Does it give you hope?
Well, I think it's important. I mean, the important thing at this point, because people don't even know about this problem right now. And the important thing to do at this moment is to open people's eyes and to explain to them the connection that phosphorus has with poisoned water and with our nutrition. And so, yeah, the idea of recycling human waste it's significant, and I think, but it's also symbolic. It's recognizing that waste isn't waste. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just kind of mind-blowing, the idea of how the circle of life isn't an abstraction, it's real. And we got to get back to that idea that you use something, you don't use it once, you use it and then you reuse it and you reuse it. It's like water, it's just the way I live in Milwaukee. I flush my toilet and then I drink water out of Lake Michigan, and it's the same stuff, but there's ways to manage it so you're not getting sick. That's just the nature of life on Earth. I have a line in the book about, I don't remember exactly what I said, but how if you think of, Earth as like a life raft with 8 billion souls aboard, and you should, then you got to realize that we don't have an inexhaustible supply of nutrients or fresh water, or safe fresh water. So I think the human waste component is important because it is nutritionally significant, and it's also significant in protecting the health of freshwater bodies. But the bigger, lower hanging fruit, I think, are the big factory farms, the CAFOs, and this policy of the ethanol mandate, which 40% of the corn we're growing right now goes to fuel in our tank, a fuel in our tank that nobody really wants except for some guys in Iowa. Everybody has pretty much concluded that ethanol is not the magic answer to energy security and to renewable energy, because the inputs to make the stuff, it's basically a wash as far as energy wise, maybe even not a wash, maybe a negative. And then also all the nutrients we're putting on fields to grow this stuff to put in our tanks. And those nutrients, inevitably, some of them wash off and poison the water. It's like right out of Dr. Seuss. We're growing food to put gas in our car at the same time we're poisoning our drinking water. It's some ways that simple. And there aren't simple answers to this, but the first step toward finding a more sustainable future is recognizing this and getting the public educated, and then moving forward with the idea that, look, we are not sitting on top of a endless supply of everything that we need. We need to live in balance. And I'm not a hippie. I sound like one right now, because I think they're onto something.
Yeah, you had an interesting story about going to the Iowa caucuses, right? And when in 2019 and asking for the presidential candidates about ethanol, and specifically President Biden, and just how the timing of that caucus shaped some of the debates going forward.
Yeah, at some point, some of this became a little personal because I was over at the University of Wisconsin that year. It was August of 2019. And I had a daughter who was at school there. I have two daughters who are at school there now. And there's a beautiful place on the University of Wisconsin campus. It's the backside of the student union. It's this terrace that overlooks Lake Mendota, which is a beautiful lake, bucolic, and just filled with sailboats. But too often now, it's also filled with this toxic algae that's grown because of excess phosphorus, because of the agriculture operations in the basin. And so I drove straight from there after being, nobody was on the water the day I was there because it was just like spinach, like cream spinach, and that stuff is poisonous. And I drove from there to Iowa the next day. I got there the next day because a lot of this problem can be traced back to politics. And by that, I mean ethanol, and specifically as it relates to Iowa. If you want to be president of the United States, you've pretty much got to do well in Iowa. And to do well in Iowa, because it's the first on the schedule of the presidential primary calendar, if you want to do well in those caucuses, you've got to support ethanol, because more than, it's like 57% of the corn grown in Iowa goes to ethanol. And there's a lot of manufacturers, refiners, whatever they do with it to turn it into that fuel. They love it. They absolutely love it. I haven't found anybody else who does, but the candidates all have to pledge allegiance to ethanol, you know, if they want to do well in Iowa. And I found Joe Biden was willing to say that, and Elizabeth Warren. Like, I mean, I like walked up to him because it was early in the presidential season, so they were very accessible. And it was a little disheartening to just hear these guys just, you know, not thinking hard, or if they've thought hard about it, they're keeping it to themselves. And the answer to that, I guess, is pushing Iowa back on the primary calendar, which is happening for the Democrats. And I don't know if it's going to actually be in place next time around, but for different reasons, because Iowa isn't always considered the most representative state for the American public. So therefore, it shouldn't have that undue influence on presidential politics being at the front of the primary season. But yeah, I mean, even people you think should know better or do know better don't speak out against ethanol. And that's a big step to solving this problem. 40% of the corn doesn't need to be grown if we're not going to eat it. And you know, there are answers, alternatives to oil beyond putting millions and millions of acres in production for a product that nobody really wants, except for some people who are living off of it in Iowa.
Yeah, it was a great story and a great example. So thanks. Going on a sort of a different note and talking about the chapter on dirty soap, you chronicle the fight that a lot of environmentalists and conservationists were engaged in to reduce phosphorus in laundry and dishwashing soap. And I love the story of David Schindler's research on Canadian lakes and the impact that this research had on changing the fate of phosphorus pollution. It's you lay it out very clearly. And it just struck me that I don't think we have that very clear connection all the times with sort of scientific study and then change of regulation. And you know, you talk about the marketing campaign from Procter and Gamble, and we're in, I sort of feel like an era of heightened discourse with, you know, sort of media and marketing campaigns versus science. Mm-hmm. And why do you think science won out in this case, or in that case, I mean?
Well, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I've never had this thought before, but it's kind of like World War I and World War II. World War I, and so Phosphorus War I was in the 50s and 60s. And back then it was pretty simple. There was a battle line, and it was basically defined as poisoned water or unbridled industry. And at the time, you know, they were calling Lake Erie America's Dead Sea, and that was because of these huge algae explosions. And at the time, that stuff wasn't always necessarily toxic, but it was still hugely problematic because all that algae would die and decompose and burn up the oxygen in Lake Erie and create these vast dead zones, hence the Dead Sea. And industry really fought this. And the idea of restricting, you know, what they could discharge into water, and the detergent industry in particular. And at the time they were saying, well, it's not, because at that time detergent was like largely phosphorus because it was a critical component of this artificial soap. And they were saying, well, it's not phosphorus, it's nitrogen, or it's carbon, or it's something else. And these Canadian scientists went up, and it was just like just a battle line just drawn. They're like, we are going to show you um, explicitly what's causing this. And they did it by, I mean, in some ways it's comical, in some ways it's tragic, and in most ways it's brilliant. They took these lakes and they turned them into these very remote lakes in Western Ontario, turned them into oversized test tubes, and they would dose them with various pollutants to see what kind of reactions they had in terms of algae blooms. And the most famous experiment, I'm going to simplify it, but they took a peanut-shaped lake and they took a curtain, like a polyurethane, like a big shower curtain, a giant shower curtain, and separated the two lobes of the lake. And one side got phosphorus and one side got nitrogen. And if it was nitrogen causing the problem, then the detergent industry would be off the hook. But within a couple of weeks, the phosphorus side just was green as a golf course, and the other side was blue as a Canadian lake should be. And so they took this picture. They'd been telling this story through graphs and charts and data points to lawmakers for several years, and then they finally just had this picture proof, and that resulted in very swift and dramatic improvements in water quality, because they pulled or banned, they did both. The detergent industry came along eventually, but they removed phosphorus from detergents, and they also required better sewage treatment from humans, from the human source of phosphorus, and the lakes recovered dramatically. What's happening now is, so back then they calculated that Lake Erie needed a phosphorus diet. I don't remember what the numbers were. It was like 11 million tons a year. Phosphorus could go into the lake without causing these algae blooms. And they said, let's get to this number, whatever it was, and we'll fix the lake. And they committed to doing it, and they did it. And the lake, within 13 years, Dr. Seuss famously wrote about Lake Erie in 1972 and just said what a mess it was. It was like, he was rhyming with water being smeary in Lake Erie. By 1985, the lake had improved so much that these researchers at Ohio State University wrote the good doctor and said, hey, you shouldn't be saying this about Lake Erie anymore. And Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, I think his name is, replied. I got a hold of the correspondences, and he was like, you're right. And he pulled it from the Lorax because the lake had improved so quickly. That was in 1985. But that probably belongs back in the Lorax, because Lake Erie is a mess again. And again, we know what the problem is. This time it's not phosphorus and detergent or wanton polluting from industries with smokestacks and pipes. It's agriculture. And just like back then, we have a prescription to fix the problem, to cure the lake. And it's a 40% reduction of phosphorus flowing into the Western Basin, specifically in the Maumee watershed, I believe. Back then we had laws, and we had sticks as well as carrots. Right now all we have is carrots. We pay farmers not to pollute, but it's not working. Otherwise, Lake Erie, they wouldn't have these annual, forecasts of how bad the algae blooms are going to be. And so it's time to regulate agriculture better. And I'm sure a lot of farmers have a problem with that, but they should also have a problem with the idea that they can't go fishing on the same waters that they fished when they were young. And they can make the argument that this is going to cause food prices or dairy prices to increase. Well, yeah, but we're already paying prices right now for the system in place, in the form of beaches that you can't swim at. I mean, you go to Maumee Bay State Park in August, and it's hot there in August, and you want to swim, and there's these signs saying you can't, and it's because of phosphorus, and that's because of primarily agricultural pollution. So there are prices that we're paying for this food system that we've developed over the past half century that don't show up on a ledger, but they're real. I mean, they're real as your family vacation, and that needs to be recognized. And that's one of the things I try to point out in this book, that we're not seeing the true costs of our modern agriculture system, and we need to account for them. And then I think we can start moving forward. And I don't want any farmer to go out of business. And I have 4 kids, and we've gone through a lot of milk in our lives, and as it should be. But they also deserve to go down to the beach and swim safely.
So I have a few more questions, but one of the attendee questions follows up really well on what you were just talking about. The question is, what specific regulations on agricultural practices would make sense?
I'm not prescriptive on this. I can't tell you exactly what, but when the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, they made a big distinction between point source polluters and non-point source polluters, and the non-point are the fields. And it did make sense at the time, but I think now many of these operations have gotten so big that they are, by definition, point source polluters. And that means that the waste that they spread, the manure, it's not waste. That's the problem. I even get sucked into thinking this. It's the manure that they spread is not waste. It is a trove of fertilizer, of nutrition for humanity. And we probably need to figure out how to process it so it can be stored in inert, safe forms. I mean, you can pelletize the phosphorus in manure into something that's just as pure as anything that's coming from a chemical fertilizer factory derived from stuff pulled from the ground and heavily refined. We can do that. We just don't have the collective will at this point to do it. And the farmers, a lot of them will say, that's pie in the sky stuff. It's just going to be too expensive. It's like, well, go to the beach. Go to the beach in August and see how well this is working for everybody. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to denigrate, disparage, point fingers at agriculture. I just want to connect some dots and to, sketch a picture that shows there's room for both. There's room for, there has to be, because we have to eat, but we also have to have fresh water. And they appear to be kind of on a collision course at the moment.
Yeah. Well, and my final question before we open it up is, I know many of us on the call read your book, The Death and the Life of the Great Lakes, and sort of seen this next book focus so much on phosphorus. I have to ask the question of, does this stand out to you as the most sort of intractable problem in the Great Lakes?
I don't know. I don't know. The thing is like we worry and we, as we should, about so many problems in the Great Lakes, but that's also because they're still so majestic and spectacular. And it's not like they're America's Dead Seas at all. And I wouldn't try to rank them. Back when I wrote the Great Lakes book, I was really focused on what's happened to the lakes since the 1959 opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And that brought all these invasive species that have had a huge impact. And the invasive species are actually related to what's going on with the algae blooms now as well, because we got all these mussels that will eat any kind of thing floating in the water, but this toxic algae, they'll spit it out. They're brainless, but they're smart enough not to eat it. And that's basically selected for all this toxic algae that's plaguing not just the Great Lakes, but water bodies across the country. So they're not unrelated, but I'm not gonna say phosphorus is the biggest issue and invasive species is the second biggest issue and water diversions are the third. Everybody's got their own pet issues, and mine become very pet-like when I'm writing about them. But we've got problems, but we also have some really spectacular lakes. And so we need to recognize that and work on these problems. It's not a this or that, a win or lose situation. We can keep industry healthy and we can make sure the lakes are healthy for future generations if we just commit to it.
So now is technically the designated time for Q&A. If anyone in the audience would like to ask questions, please submit them at this time. And Laura, if you have any more questions, you can just keep going and I'll pop in if I get anything in the Q&A.
Okay, so does that mean you don't have any at this point?
I do not have any at this point. You asked the one that I did have. So
okay, so I'll encourage more people
we've covered
to submit them. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Oh, I see one just popped in. When's your book on nitrogen coming out?
Somebody else can write that. I realized early on that there is in the biological community there are nitrogen people and phosphorus people, and they almost seem like rivals, and that's so in the weeds. I don't even want to get into that. But I know I'm not going to write it. Well, I mean, this book's only 8 days old or 9 days old.
So
I've been asked. So this is I think the third time I'm talking today. People keep asking me, what are you going to write about next? And it's
yeah, Dan, that is unfortunately the next question we have. What is the next book's topic? I know we already talked about this before this all started. You'd like to take a breather.
Yeah, I like relax like I'm doing now. No, I don't know, but I'm a full on Wisconsin Great Lakes person, and I intend to keep writing and reporting, and I am attuned to environmental issues. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested in climate change and how it affects the lakes specifically, because in many ways this seems like a sanctuary, but we're also kind of uniquely vulnerable in terms of water. So
now we have many questions. So
I thought we were going to get out of this.
A viewer asked, Americans seem unable to grapple with the Farm Bill, which drives so much of high input agriculture. Any thoughts about engaging more citizens in the Farm Bill debate?
So I was asked in Traverse City a week ago if I would write a book about the Farm Bill, and I'll tell you what, that's like above my grade as far as, well, I haven't spent any time trying to understand the ins and outs and the history of that, but that really does drive a lot of this. And I'm just not equipped to speak intelligently about what needs to, because I think this is a Farm Bill year coming up, and we can steer agriculture in different directions, and the direction that we've steered it in with the system we have now is not a good direction. And so, but I'm not gonna get into the weeds or the wheat, if you will, of Farm Bill.
Yeah, many of the environmental groups and conservation groups are in the process of pulling together their platforms on the Farm Bill, because it's just starting to be considered at the federal level.
So now we have a question from someone who's a member of the Illinois Beaver Alliance, who would like to know how your book relates to aquatic mammals.
I didn't know beavers allied. Let me think about this. Dogs die swimming in this poison water. Dogs are mammals. When I was down in Florida, you're gonna have to help me out here, because first of all, I probably should have said at the outset, I'm not a scientist, but I saw armadillos like toddling across this microcystis goop in Stuart, Florida. It blew my mind that animals, mammal. I think that's what my question, are armadillos mammals? I would imagine they are. They have shells though. Anyway, it's getting a little far afield. I guess the short answer is toxic algae affects mammals a lot, humans included. And I was a little squeamish about writing about some of this stuff, because there's emerging concern and evidence that like humans exposed to this toxic algae don't just get liver problems or respiratory problems, but it's associated with neurological diseases like ALS. And there's been no causation link, but there's been some studies in New Hampshire where people who live by these lakes that are infested with this toxic algae, they don't have to live on the lake, they just live near it. There's spikes in ALS, and the idea is that there's a protein in this microcystin, which is produced by this toxic algae called microcystis. It's actually a cyanobacteria. that's a mechanism for neurodegenerative disease.
Yeah.
So, but I don't spend a lot of time talking about how it affects mammals, but I am glad that there is a Beaver Alliance, because I won't run over, but on my nightstand, I've got a beaver book. There's two really good ones. There's Eager and by Ben Goldfarb, and I can't remember the other one. The other one's on my nightstand right
And I'll just add, I was really glad that you covered that story between ALS and toxic algal blooms. I think in the environmental field, we have a lot of these sort of semi-causal issues with a lot of chemicals, PFAS and autism and the most famous DDT. And, I mean, there's different things, but I thought it was very interesting for you to include it.
Yeah, there was some debate I had with the editor. It's like, do we really want to explore this? And, do I want to stick my neck out here? But I think I couched it, as a non-scientist who's a reporter, but I work with scientists. You kind of triangulate. You talk to a number of them, and you try to find a mini consensus, and then move forward with that. And I think it's definitely something that people should think about. But I also don't want to be alarmist, and so I'm walking a tightrope here, and I hope I don't fall.
Our next question is, so earlier you talked about carbon and it not being a limiting nutrient, but Canadian lake research indicated that the lake pulled CO2 from the air, and now we have twice as much carbon in the air as 100 years ago. At what point does the increased carbon become a factor? Did you learn anything about this during your research for the book?
Well, one of the things that was really interesting, we're getting into the aquatic weeds here, but as I recall, they were taking carbon studies of these lakes that were dosed with phosphorus and nitrogen, and every morning there was way more carbon in the lakes that they were studying than had been there the night before. And basically the lakes were breathing. And this is not something that can be done in a laboratory on an aquarium scale. It needs to be out happening on the landscape. And so carbon is obviously a factor in growth. We're going to have likely increased crop productivity because of the accessibility of carbon in the atmosphere. And it should be the same, logically speaking, and let the limnologists step in here. But it seems that more carbon is going to mean more growth of everything, including cyanobacteria and blue-green algae specifically. So yeah, and one of the things that I was really wrestling with is like, why is all this algae becoming more toxic, or why are these blooms more likely to be toxic than they were in the 60s? And I think the factor is heat and carbon and just long-term weather patterns. So.
And our final question for the evening, the role of phosphorus is causing both benefits and tremendous challenges in our lives. Politicians and big companies haven't yet stepped up. So as a resident of the Great Lakes, is there anything we as individuals can do?
There's this book. I'm just gonna say it. Yeah. No, I mean it's to get that's where I get off the train. I just want to educate the public, point out the connection between our modern agriculture system and our water issues, and I'll leave it at that. As far as, I really don't want it to be perceived as this call to action. It's just really it's sketching a picture that should make you want to do something, but I'll leave that up to others.
I think that's a great way to end this, because we're reaching the top of the hour. So Dan and Laura, thank you for joining us on At Home with Literati, and thank you to Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition for partnering with us on this event. Thanks to all of our viewers. Make sure you buy the book. The link is in the chat, on the event listing that brought you here, and of course, in our store. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.